David and his 17-year-old son had an absolutely horrifying encounter with a Sasquatch while hiking up to Mount Isolation in New Hampshire. But before we get into their encounter, welcome back to Dark Wilderness, where I share encounters with the unexplained. If you've had an encounter that you would like to share, please email me at the link below. And if you like today's story, please gently slap that like button, as I'll be uploading multiple times every week. So if you come out of your tent and you see an 11-foot Sasquatch in front of you, before you go sliding down a ravine, make sure you grab that subscribe button so you don't miss out on any future content. Now, let's get into today's encounter. This encounter comes from David, and it happened in 2020 while him and his 17-year-old son Tristan were hiking the Rocky Branch Trail out in White Mountain National Park in New Hampshire. The Rocky Branch Trail runs for about 18.2 miles. It takes about 9.5 to 10 hours to hike. However, most people will generally camp about halfway down this trail. It's located right in the heart of the Appalachian Mountains, an absolutely remote and rugged wilderness. It's an area that David and his son went to quite often. They were very experienced backpackers, very experienced backcountry campers, and it was just something that they enjoyed to do together as a father and son bonding experience. They had been planning this trip for a couple of weeks. They had actually hiked the Rocky Branch Trail before. However, for this particular hike, they were going to do things a little bit different. Instead of launching at the North Trailhead, taking the trail all the way around to the South Trailhead, having David's wife pick them up and bring them back to his vehicle, they were actually going to be going from the North Trailhead, taking the trail to where the trail starts to turn south towards the South Trailhead, and from there they were going to go off trail heading northwest up towards Mount Isolation. They had never gone to Mount Isolation before, and it was something that both David and Tristan really wanted to do. And now that Tristan was 17 years old, David figured that he was big enough that he would be able to handle himself should something happen to him. So that's what they had planned to do for this particular trip. David had Friday off, so Friday morning, him and his son, they loaded all their gear into the truck, and then they made their drive all the way out to White Mountain Park. When they got to the North Trailhead, they kind of pulled all their gear out of the truck, just did a double take, just to make sure that they had everything they needed. Once they determined that, yes, they did have everything they needed, they put their packs on, and they started making their way down the trail. They walked for several hours, basically just talking and enjoying each other's company. They crossed the Rocky Branch River, and within a few hours, they were at that part of the trail where it turns south. When they got to that spot, they stopped, and they kind of started talking between them, just confirming that for sure that they did want to try making it to Mount Isolation. They had never done any off-trail hiking like that before, so this was their last chance to decide if they really want to proceed with this or not. After a couple minutes of talking, they decided, yeah, no, they for sure want to go to Mount Isolation. So they turned and they started heading off into the wilderness. When they got off trail, both David and Tristan realized that travel was a lot more difficult. Now, instead of walking along a nice groomed trail, they had to climb over fallen trees, go down into ravines, and climb ridges. By the time it was starting to get dark, they had only made it about a mile off the trail. David had looked up, saw the sky, saw that the sun was going down, so he called Tristan over to him, and he told his son that they needed to find a spot to set up camp, and they needed to do it now before it was dark. So they kind of branched off from each other, and they just went looking for a nice flat place where they could set up their camp. Tristan found a spot right at the top of this one ridge, so he called his dad over. So David walked up to where Tristan was, looked around, and determined that this was probably the best spot that they were going to be able to find to camp before it was dark. So together they dropped their packs and they got to setting up camp. Once the tent was set up, David told Tristan to get all their gear inside and to bring out the camp stove, some water, and some MREs, while he kind of made a little spot outside just to set up the camp stove so that he could heat up some water so that they can eat. So while he's outside clearing a little spot for the camp stove, he could hear Tristan inside the tent kind of rummaging through the bags. A couple seconds later, Tristan comes out of the tent. He has the camp stove, the MREs, some water, and he's also holding David's 45 in his hand. He looks at his dad and said, "Hey dad, why did you bring this?" David said to Tristan, "Well, we're in bear country. We're in the middle of nowhere. That's just some extra protection just in case." So David reached over. He actually took the 45 from Tristan first, put it on his hip. Then he got to setting up the camp stove and getting some water boiling for food. By the time that they had started eating, it was full on dark outside. And about halfway through their meal, Tristan looked right at David and he said, "Hey dad, why is it so quiet?" In that moment, David realized exactly how quiet the area was. He did not hear any crickets. He did not hear any other bugs. He heard nothing at all. And that put him pretty on edge. But he looked at his son and he said, generally when it goes quiet like this, generally that means there's a predator in the area. He said, so let's just finish eating, then we'll head into the tent and we're going to call it a night. Just as they were finishing eating their meal, they heard this loud crack come from the woods right behind the tent, followed by the sound of something very large moving through the woods. That made David even more on edge, so he put his hand on his pistol, stood up, went into the tent, and he came out a couple seconds later with a box of flares. He took one out, lit it, and he put it on a rock right beside where the camp stove was. He looked at Tristan and said, this should keep away any animals. Let's just head into the tent and let's just call it a night now. So the two guys, they made their way into the tent, and shortly after getting settled in, Tristan fell asleep, but David could not fall asleep, not yet. He needed to make sure that whatever that was gone. So he just kind of lied there for a little while, holding his pistol close, just listening to the woods, trying to see if he could hear any sign of whatever that was that moved around behind the tent. After determining that whatever that was long gone, David slowly drifted off to sleep. He was awoken a short time later by Tristan shaking him, saying, Dad, 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 there's something outside. So David's all groggy. He opens his eyes, kind of trying to figure out why his son's waking him up. And Tristan said to him, Dad, there's something outside the tent. He said, I could hear it breathing. I heard it rub up against the tent. So David looked at Tristan, told him to be quiet. And David just kind of sat there for a minute, just kind of listening to see if he could hear whatever this was that Tristan heard. After a few seconds, David noticed that there's definitely something outside the tent. He could hear it moving probably about 20 feet from the tent over towards where that flare had been. A few seconds later, they heard the sound of their camp stove being knocked over, followed by what David describes as a very deep grunt that he described as sounding like, whoa. And when he heard that, he had no idea what made that sound. So he grabbed his pistol and he made his way to the front of the tent. He unzipped it just enough to look outside, but he could not see anything because it was just way too dark. So he looked at Tristan and said, I'm going to go check it out. And Tristan said, I'm going with you. Dave kind of just gave his son a nod, unzipped the tent the rest of the way. And the two guys, they got out of the tent and they stood up. David instantly noticed that directly in front of him, about 20 feet away, right over top where their camp stove was this absolutely massive silhouette. But he could not see exactly what this was just because it was so dark. All of a sudden, from right beside him, he just hears followed by just a blinding light. And he noticed that Tristan was actually holding one of those flares out like this. As soon as that flare illuminated the area, both of them got a perfect look at this thing standing right in front of them. And David describes this thing as being an 11-foot tall Sasquatch covered in dark reddish brown hair. He said the color of the hair was kind of hard to make out because it was from the light of this flare. But he said it appeared to be a reddish brown. He said it was absolutely massive. Massive shoulders, massive arms, massive legs, and it was looking away from them. Almost instantly, this thing turned around and looked directly at these two guys. Both of them just kind of stood there staring right back at this Sasquatch. David didn't know what to do at this point. He knew he had to protect his son. He knew he had his pistol, but when he was looking at the sheer size of this thing, he knew that his .45 would likely not do anything to this Sasquatch. So they just stood there kind of in fear, staring back. This Sasquatch started to take a couple of steps towards them. And in that moment, David drew his .45 and he fired a shot into the ground, hoping that the bang would at least scare this thing away. However, in retaliation to that shot, this Sasquatch, David said, let out just an absolutely guttural scream. He could feel it resonate through his body. He reached over, grabbed Tristan's arm, pulled him, and told him to run. The two of them ran right for the top of the ridge, and they started sliding down the ridge itself. They slid for about 60 feet before they hit a big pile of deadfall timber, and as soon as they hit that, they climbed up over it, and they kind of used that as like a bunker to shield them from this Sasquatch. David said as soon as they climbed over these trees, he could hear the Sasquatch at the top of the ridge where their camp was, absolutely demolishing their camp. He could hear this thing screaming, grunting. He could hear the tent being ripped apart. He could hear things being thrown around. And when that started, he was just feared for him and his son's lives. They ended up spending the entire night hiding in this little deadfall pile of trees. And when the sun finally started to come up, David just abandoned all their gear, said to Tristan, "Let's run." And the two guys, they tried to run back to that main trail. When they hit the main trail, they sprinted like they have never run before. And David said that they covered so much ground so quick, he does not know how he managed to run that far. When they got back to their truck, both of them were just happy to be alive and happy that this ordeal was over. David's advice is if you're going backcountry camping, especially in a really remote area like where him and his son were, he said go in a bigger group, don't just go two people. And he said if you ever do come across one of these Sasquatches, he said that they're not intimidated by the sound of a gunshot. He said, so do not fire a shot thinking that you will scare these things away. He said that that gunshot just kind of triggered an anger response from this thing. He doesn't know exactly what would have happened if he would not have taken that shot, but he feels like that shot triggered more aggressiveness from this thing. So his advice again is just always go in bigger groups and just try not to intimidate these things if you come across them. Well, that's it for today's encounter. As always, thanks for joining us, and if you have any comments, please leave them in the comments below. And if you haven't done so already, if you come out of your tent and you see an 11-foot Sasquatch, before you go running and sliding down into a ravine, grab that subscribe button, and I'll see you next time.